Gaius was a man of letters, not of swords. He spent his days in the cool, echoing halls of the Basilica Julia, a public building where legal cases were heard. He was a simple scribe, his hands more used to holding a reed pen than a shield. To him, the Roman Empire was a great, beautiful machine of law and order. He believed in the 12 tables of Roman law, the senators in their grand robes, and the idea that justice, though sometimes slow, was always a sure thing. His life was quiet and predictable. He lived in a small apartment on the Esquiline Hill, had a small garden of his own, and spent his evenings reading old scrolls by the light of an oil lamp. His only concern was keeping his writing neat and his documents in order. He had a simple, almost naive faith in the system that governed his world. But that faith was about to be shattered by a case that seemed, at first, to be entirely ordinary. It was a case about a dispute over land. A wealthy patrician, a man named Tiberius, claimed that a small farmer, a retired centurion named Quintus, had stolen a piece of his land. The evidence was all against Quintus. Tiberius had witnesses, documents, and the full weight of his influence behind him. Quintus, a simple man with a scarred face and a tired posture, had only his word. Gaius was tasked with transcribing the testimony, his pen scratching across the parchment, his mind already forming the verdict he knew was coming. But something felt wrong. The witnesses for Tiberius were too smooth, their stories too perfect. They spoke as if from a script. Quintus, on the other hand, fumbled with his words, his truth buried under his fear and his lack of education. He spoke of old boundary markers and promises made long ago, things that could not be proven. After the hearing ended and the verdict went against Quintus, Gaius felt a strange, nagging doubt. He knew the law was on Tiberius's side, but something in his gut told him justice had not been served. That night, he found himself unable to sleep. He remembered Quintus's eyes, the look of utter defeat and hopelessness, and he knew he could not simply let it go. Driven by a feeling he couldn't name, he decided to do something he had never done before, to investigate on his own, to look for a truth that was not written in the official records. He began by discreetly looking at other cases involving Tiberius. He found a pattern. Every few years, Tiberius would acquire a new piece of land, a small farm, or a vineyard, always from a poor citizen who had no power or connections. The cases were all the same: witnesses, documents, a quick verdict, and then the land was sold at a high price. It was a business model, not a legal one. Gaius's hands trembled as he read the old documents. This wasn't justice. It was a slow, legal theft, a system designed to protect the powerful and crush the weak. He knew that if he brought this to light, he would be risking everything: his job, his reputation, maybe even his life. He was just a scribe. What could he do against a man like Tiberius, a man with friends in the Senate and influence with the judges? The perfect machine of law and order suddenly seemed more like a hungry beast, and he was standing right in its path. His investigation grew more dangerous. He started talking to people, to the scribes who had worked on the previous cases, to the servants who had once worked for the dispossessed farmers. Their faces were full of fear, their words hesitant and brief, but they all told the same story, a quiet warning to leave well enough alone. "Some things are better left unsaid, Gaius," one old scribe whispered to him, his eyes darting around the room as if an invisible predator was listening. But Gaius couldn't stop. He was driven by a righteous anger, a feeling that justice could not be bought and sold. He learned that the witnesses who testified for Tiberius were not ordinary citizens, but paid actors, men who were experts at memorizing scripts and playing their parts perfectly in the court. He learned that the official documents had been expertly forged, with old ink and subtle changes that made them look a century old. He even found a small, personal diary from a farmer who had lost his land to Tiberius. The farmer had written of his desperation, his pleas to the courts, and his final, terrible realization that the law was not for him, that it was a weapon of the powerful. The diary ended with a single, tragic line: "The stones of Rome are polished with the tears of men like me." Gaius felt a cold knot of fear form in his stomach. He was no longer investigating a simple land dispute. He was uncovering a vast, powerful criminal conspiracy hiding in plain sight, using the very laws of Rome as its shield. He knew he had enough evidence to expose Tiberius. He carefully compiled all his notes, the old documents, and the personal testimony into a single, comprehensive scroll. He knew he had to get it to someone honest, someone powerful enough to do something, maybe a senator he could trust, a man known for his integrity. But as he rolled up the scroll, a sudden, chilling realization hit him. He had been so focused on the documents and the evidence that he had forgotten to watch his back. His apartment was on the top floor, and there was a single, narrow staircase. There was no way to get past anyone waiting for him. As if on cue, he heard the creak of the door downstairs, followed by the slow, heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs, not the light tread of a neighbor, but the deliberate sound of men who meant business. He looked around his small room, his heart pounding in his chest. There was nowhere to hide. He was trapped. The scroll felt like a lead weight in his hand, a testament to his own stupidity. He had believed in the beautiful machine of law and order, and he had been foolish enough to get his hand caught in its gears. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Gaius knew that the truth, the justice he had so foolishly sought, was about to be buried with him. The danger of Rome wasn't on the battlefields or in the streets. It was here, in the quiet places, in the corruption that had become the law itself. And the footsteps were now outside his door. And in the sudden, terrible silence that followed, Gaius's heart hammered a frantic beat against his ribs. A wild bird trapped in a cage, a sound so loud he was sure the men on the other side of the thin wooden door could hear it. He clutched the incriminating scroll to his chest, the papyrus a fragile shield against the coming violence, and his mind, so accustomed to the slow, methodical pace of a scribe's work, raced, desperately searching for a solution, a plan, any way out of the impossible situation he had so naively created for himself. The silence stretched on, a cruel game of cat and mouse, and then, a single, sharp knock rattled the door in its frame, a sound that was not a request but a demand, a promise of a future he did not want to see. Gaius backed away from the door, his eyes scanning his small room, a space that had always felt like a sanctuary, now a tomb, a prison with no windows save for the small, barred one that looked out onto a blank stone wall. He thought of his life, of the simple pleasures he had enjoyed, the taste of fresh bread, the scent of his small garden, the satisfying scratch of his pen on parchment, and he knew that all of it, every small and perfect detail, was about to be taken from him. He had been so focused on the injustice done to a stranger that he had forgotten the danger that came with challenging the powerful, the invisible lines of power that ran like poison through the veins of Rome, the corruption that had become so common it was no longer seen as a crime, but a way of life. The second knock was harder, a punch against the wood, and a voice, low and full of a cold authority, spoke from the other side. "Gaius, open the door. We know you are in there. We have a warrant from the court for the return of certain documents." The lie was as smooth and perfect as the forged documents he had uncovered, and Gaius felt a surge of cold fury, a desperate anger that momentarily pushed aside his fear. They were not just criminals. They were hypocrites, using the very laws they had corrupted to steal the truth he had found. He was not just a victim. He was a symbol of their perfect, cynical world, a world where truth was a commodity and justice was for sale. He had to do something. He could not just open the door and surrender. He was a scribe, a man of words, and he had to use his words, his mind, to find a way out. He thought of the scroll in his hand, the carefully compiled evidence, the names, the dates, the tragic story of the farmer who had lost everything. He could not let it fall into their hands, to be destroyed, to be buried forever, along with the truth it contained. The door creaked ominously as someone pushed against it, and Gaius knew he had only seconds. His eyes fell upon his oil lamp, its small flame casting a warm, comforting glow on the table, and a terrible idea, a reckless, desperate plan, formed in his mind. He would not let them have the truth. If he could not save himself, he would at least save the story, the proof of their terrible crime. With trembling hands, Gaius poured a small amount of oil onto the end of the scroll, the liquid soaking into the porous papyrus, turning the words of his investigation into a death sentence for his own work. He knew it was a foolish act, a desperate final protest, but he could not bear the thought of them getting their hands on his work, of them erasing his efforts as easily as they had erased the land from the farmer's name. As the door began to the papyrus caught fire, the fire spreading in a small, hungry circle, and in the last moment, as the scroll turned to a black crisp, a small, almost invisible symbol he had not noticed before appeared on the scorched papyrus. A mark so tiny it was almost missed, a small snake, curled around a single, elegant letter T. It was a mark of a secret society, a symbol of their power, a symbol he now knew stood for Tiberius. And then, the door burst open with a crash, and two men, their faces hidden in the shadows, their eyes like cold stones, lunged into the room. Gaius stood, the burning scroll in his hand, and he met their gaze, his fear replaced by a quiet defiance. He had lost, but he had not let them win. And as one of the men moved toward him, his hand reaching for the scroll, Gaius threw the flaming papyrus at his face, a last, desperate act of rebellion. The man roared in surprise and pain as the burning papyrus hit his face, and for a brief, glorious moment, there was chaos in the room. The second man, distracted by his friend, looked away for a split second, and it was all the time Gaius needed. He lunged past them, a blur of motion fueled by desperation, and he dove out of the door, his feet pounding on the narrow staircase, his lungs burning with the effort. He did not look back. He just ran, the sounds of the enraged men behind him a terrible soundtrack to his escape. He ran down the staircase, out of his apartment building, and into the crowded, loud streets of Rome, a city that had once felt so safe, and now felt like a terrifying, dangerous maze. He was a small, fragile man, a single word against an empire of lies, and he was running, a fugitive from a crime he had not committed, a man who had dared to believe in justice in a city that had long since forgotten the meaning of the word. He was no longer a scribe. He was a ghost, a shadow, a man without a home, and the darkness of Rome was closing in around him. He ran past merchants selling their wares, past senators in their togas, past legionaries marching in formation, and he saw, with a terrible clarity, that they were all just cogs in the great, beautiful machine of law and order, a machine that was powered by corruption and fueled by injustice, and he was just a small, insignificant piece of dirt, caught in its gears. And the shadows were chasing him. The secret society, the one with the snake and the letter T, had seen his face, and they would not forget. He had to disappear, to find a new identity, to live in the shadows he had so foolishly ignored, to become a ghost in the city that had once been his home. The sounds of the men behind him were getting closer. He had to run down a rhythmic, pounding drumbeat of footsteps on the stone staircase, a terrible symphony of pursuit that drove Gaius forward, his lungs burning, his legs screaming with every desperate stride, a small, insignificant man running from a powerful and unseen enemy, and he did not look back, could not look back, for fear that if he did, he would see the cold, unblinking eyes of the men who had come to take his life and bury the truth. He burst out of the narrow, dark alley that held his home and into the blinding midday light of the Vicus Patricius, the street of the patricians, a place he had always avoided, a place of grand, sprawling villas and tall, intimidating walls, a place that now, ironically, felt like his only chance. The streets were crowded, filled with merchants yelling their wares, slaves carrying heavy loads, and senators in their clean togas, and Gaius, a ghost among the living, a man without a face in a city of thousands, wove through the throng, pushing, shoving, not apologizing, for politeness was a luxury he could no longer afford. He saw a legionary, a strong, armed man, standing guard at a street corner, and for a fleeting moment, a foolish thought of safety flashed through his mind, a desperate hope that the law, in the form of this soldier, would protect him. But then he remembered the forged warrants, the corrupt courts, the lie of justice, and he knew that the legionary would see only a panicked man and the two powerful figures chasing him. And he would not interfere. The law was on their side, not his. He ducked down another alleyway, smaller and darker than the last, a place of garbage and rats, a place where the sun never reached, and he heard the shouts behind him, the voices of the men now separated from each other, spreading out, trying to corner him, and Gaius knew he could not outrun them forever. They were trained, they were faster, they were relentless. He had to find a place to hide, a place to disappear, to become truly invisible. His mind, so used to the order of a library, was now a whirlwind of frantic, chaotic thoughts. He saw a small door, half hidden behind a pile of broken amphorae, the door to a storeroom for a nearby tavern, and he didn't hesitate, he just pushed, the old wood groaning in protest as he forced his way inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud, plunging him into the total darkness of the space. The air was thick with the smell of old wine and dust, and he stumbled blindly, his hands reaching out to touch the cool, rough surface of the amphory, his heart a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, suffocating silence. He was a fugitive, trapped in a small, dark room, with two killers waiting for him just outside, and he had nowhere to go. He sank to the floor, his back against the cold, hard wall, and he listened, his every sense heightened, his body a trembling mess of fear and exhaustion, and he heard the men outside, their footsteps slowing down, their voices now low, cold whispers, searching for him, hunting him. "He went this way," one of them said, his voice as sharp as a thrown knife. "He must have gone in here." There was a brief silence, and Gaius held his breath, every muscle in his body rigid with fear, his mind picturing them, their faces still hidden in shadow, their eyes like cold stones, their hands on the hilts of their swords, and he knew that if they opened that door, his life was over. "No," the other voice said, a voice that was both familiar and terrifying. "The door is locked from the outside. He couldn't have gone in there. He's not here. He must have kept going. Check the Sabura." Gaius felt a moment of incredible relief, a wave of hope so powerful it almost made him cry, and he heard their footsteps retreat, growing softer and softer until they were gone, and he was alone again in the silent, dark room. He had been so close to death, and now, for a moment, he was safe. He pushed himself to his feet, his body still shaking, and he felt his way to the door, pressing his ear against the wood, listening for any sound of their return. He waited for a long time, the minutes stretching into an eternity, until he was sure they were gone, and then, with a trembling hand, he found the latch on the inside and pushed the door open a crack, a sliver of light cutting into the darkness, and he peered out, seeing the empty alley, the discarded amphory, the silent streets. He was free. But he knew it was a temporary freedom. They would not stop looking. They were part of a secret, powerful society, a society that used the laws of Rome as a weapon, and they would not rest until they had him, and the truth he had tried to save, and the small, almost invisible symbol he had seen on the burning scroll, the snake curled around the letter T, was a promise of their reach, of their power, a symbol of their terrible, unseen control. He had to run. But where? He had no home, no friends he could trust, no money he could use without being caught. He was a ghost in the city, and the shadows were getting closer, the truth of his new, dangerous life settling over him like a heavy, cold shroud, and he knew that the city of Rome, the beautiful machine of law and order he had once so naively believed in, was not a sanctuary, but a cage, and the bars were getting tighter. He had to find a way to disappear completely, to shed his old life and become a new man, a ghost that no one could find. But how could a simple scribe become a phantom in the most populous city in the world? And the sun was beginning to set, and the shadows were getting long and dark, and he was alone. A truth that settled over him with a chilling finality as the last hint of sunlight faded from the alley, replaced by the deep, suffocating gray of a Roman twilight, and Gaius, a man who had never been without a home, a clean tunic, or a warm meal, now felt the biting chill of a new reality, a reality of gnawing hunger and a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull him down into the grimy filth of the city's underbelly. He pushed himself to his feet, his muscles protesting with a dull, aching throb, and he moved with the hesitant, uncertain steps of a man who had lost his way in a familiar land, every sound, every rustle of a discarded scrap of papyrus, every distant laugh of a passing reveler, feeling like a threat, a signal that his pursuers had not given up, that they were still out there, searching, hunting, a terrible, invisible net drawing ever tighter around him. The Vicus Patricius, the street he had so recently fled, was now a distant, unattainable world, a memory of a time when polished marble and clean togas were the symbols of his life, a time when he had believed in the order of things, a time that now seemed as distant as the stars. He was in the Sabura, the sprawling, crowded district of the poor, a place of tall, crumbling apartment blocks, of narrow, twisting alleyways where a man could easily lose his way, a place where Gaius, the meticulous scribe, was a stranger in a foreign land. The smells were overwhelming, a harsh assault on his senses. The thick, greasy scent of cooking oil, the acrid stench of human waste, the sour odor of cheap wine, and the ever-present smell of damp stone and unwashed bodies. And he moved through it all like a ghost, his senses on high alert, his body a wire of tense, coiled fear. He passed by a tavern, its doors open, a loud, raucous noise pouring out, a celebration of life he no longer had a part in, and he saw a man, his face a web of deep, cruel scars, his eyes hard and knowing, watching the street with a predatory gaze, and Gaius quickly looked away, his heart a hammer against his ribs, his mind screaming that this was the new Rome, a Rome of shadows and predators, a Rome he had never known existed. He was no longer a man of law. He was a creature of the night, a man who had to adapt or die, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the fine clothes he wore were a curse, a sign of his old life, a beacon that would draw the wrong kind of attention, and he had to shed his past, to become a new man, a creature of the dark, invisible to the eyes of the powerful. He found a discarded tunic in a pile of refuse, a tattered, stained garment that smelled of sweat and dirt, and with a grim determination, he pulled off his own tunic and threw it into the pile, a symbolic shedding of his old life, of his foolish faith in a justice that was only for the powerful, and he pulled on the new garment, the rough fabric a shocking and terrible contrast to the soft linen he was used to, but it was a disguise. A new skin that would make him blend in, that would make him invisible. He even took a handful of mud and smeared it on his face and hands, a desperate act of self-erasure, of becoming a part of the dirt he was now forced to live in, and he felt a strange, cold sense of liberation, the freedom of a man who had nothing left to lose, who had shed his identity as easily as he had shed his clothes. As the night deepened, Gaius found an abandoned ruin, a small, half-collapsed building that had once been a temple or a bathhouse, and he crawled into a small, dark corner, the cold stone a cruel bed for his tired body, and he listened to the sounds of the Roman night. The distant baying of a stray dog, the muffled shouts of a late-night argument, the quiet, unsettling scuttling of rats. A sound he had never heard before but now knew to be the soundtrack of his life, and he shivered, not just from the cold, but from the terrible loneliness that had now become his only companion. His mind, unable to rest, replayed the events of the day, a constant, looping horror show, the forged documents, the cold eyes of the men in his doorway, the terrifying voice of Marcus, the blazing, burning scroll, the single, clear image of the snake and the letter T, a symbol he had now come to fear more than anything else in the world. A symbol of a power so vast and so hidden that it could reach into the most private corners of a man's life and destroy it without a sound. He wondered about the senator, the man who had been at a dinner party at his house just last week, and he felt a wave of nausea at the memory of his polite smile and his meaningless platitudes, a mask for the terrible, cold purpose that lay beneath, and he knew that the powerful men of Rome were not men at all, but shadows, creatures of a secret, terrible world he had just stumbled into. A world where the laws he had so carefully transcribed were just a set of rules for a game he had not even known he was playing. The thought of Quintus, the farmer, came to his mind, and he felt a profound and terrible sadness. Quintus had known this world existed. He had lived in its shadow. He had been a victim of the great, beautiful machine, and Gaius, in his foolish, naive attempt to help, had become a victim himself, a truth that was both a terrible curse and a bitter, necessary education. He survived the night, the cold seeping into his bones, and with the first light of dawn, he crept out of the ruin, his body stiff and sore, his stomach a hollow pit of hunger, and he had to find food, to find water, to find a way to live. But he had no money, not a single denarius, and his old life, the life of a man who had never had to worry about such things, felt like a distant, impossible dream. He saw a man selling bread from a cart, a simple, honest transaction that was now a luxury he could not afford, and he felt a surge of desperation, the primal need for survival pushing aside his fear and his shame. He saw a woman, a rich lady, her slave carrying her market basket, and he had a fleeting, terrible thought of snatching it, of running away with the food, but the old Gaius, the man of honor and law, still held a small, weak grip on his soul, and he could not do it, not yet, but he knew that if the hunger continued, the old Gaius would be a distant memory, and the new Gaius, the man of the shadows, would do what he had to do to survive. He wandered through the streets, a man without a purpose, a creature of the alleyways, his eyes constantly scanning, his mind a constant, ticking clock of fear, and he saw them, or at least he thought he did. Two men, their faces partially hidden by the hoods of their cloaks, standing on a street corner, their eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory efficiency, and for a terrible moment, he thought they had seen him, that they were looking directly at him, and he ducked behind a merchant's cart, his body shaking, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and he watched, his heart pounding in his ears, as they moved on, their search a patient, relentless hunt, and he knew he could not stay on the streets. He had to find a place to hide, to find a place where they would not think to look. He spent the day in the vast, labyrinthine market, the Forum Boreum, a place of noise and chaos, a place where a man could easily get lost, and he hid in the shadows, watching, learning, his mind, so used to the order of words, now learning the unwritten language of the streets, the secret signs and gestures, the way a beggar could signal a patrol guard was coming, the way a vendor could warn his friends of a thief, the intricate, secret life of a city he had never known. And in the market, he saw it again, a glimpse of the terrible symbol that had changed his life forever, a man, a powerful, well-dressed man, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, and on his ring, a small, silver emblem, a snake curled around a single, elegant letter T, and Gaius felt a cold dread, a sudden, terrifying understanding that this was not a small, secret cult, but a vast, sprawling organization. A network of powerful men, of senators and judges and merchants and guards, a poison that had infected the very heart of the empire, and they were everywhere. He was a small, fragile man, a single word against an empire of lies, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the corruption was not the disease, it was the cure, a cure they believed was necessary to save Rome from its own weaknesses, and he was a weakness that had to be cut out. His only hope, his only chance, was to find someone who knew this world, someone who lived in the shadows and knew the secrets, and he had an idea, a terrible, desperate idea that might get him killed, but it was his only option. There were whispers in the Subura of a woman who lived in the city's depths, a woman who knew things, a woman they called the Oracle of the Sewers, a creature of the dark who could see the truth that the powerful men of Rome tried so hard to hide. It was a foolish, childish rumor, a fairy tale for the desperate, but Gaius, a man with nothing left to lose, knew that he had to try. He had to find her. He had to find the Oracle, for she was his last hope, his final chance in a world where the shadows were getting longer, and the truth was getting darker, and he was all alone in a city that had once been his home, but now felt like a grave. A terrifying realization that pushed him forward, his feet dragging on the cobblestones, his body aching, his mind a desperate whirlwind of fear and a fragile, burning hope, a hope that there was someone, somewhere, who could see the truth and had the strength to stand against the lies. He began to ask around in the low, shadowy taverns of the Subura, his voice a low, raspy whisper, his eyes darting around the room, always watching, always searching for the cold, unblinking eyes of his hunters, and the men he spoke to would either laugh at him, a harsh, cruel sound, or they would turn away, their faces a mask of fear, their silence a clear warning that he was treading on ground that was too dangerous for a man like him. The Oracle? One old man, a beggar with one eye, hissed, his voice full of a terrible reverence. She is a ghost. She does not speak to men of the world. She sees the truth that is buried beneath our feet. He would not say more, his lips a tight, thin line of fear. But Gaius persisted, his desperation a relentless engine, and he learned the unwritten rules of the city's underbelly, the secret language of gestures and whispers, the places where a man could find things that were not meant to be found. He learned that the Oracle did not live in a house, or even a street, but in the depths of the city's labyrinthine sewer system, a vast, dark world that ran beneath the polished stones of Rome, a place that held the city's filth and its deepest, darkest secrets. Gaius found the entrance to the sewers late at night, a foul-smelling grate half-hidden in a dark alley, a place he would have run from in his old life, but now, it felt like an entrance to a new, terrible world, a world where he might find his only salvation. He lifted the heavy grate, the iron groaning in protest, and he climbed down the slimy, wet rungs of a ladder, the air growing colder and damper with every step, and as he reached the bottom, he was plunged into a complete, suffocating darkness, a darkness so profound it felt like a living thing, a heavy, velvet blanket that pressed in on him from all sides. The stench was overwhelming, a terrible mix of rot and decay, and he could hear the quiet, constant sound of dripping water and the scuttling of unseen creatures in the tunnels, and a wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over him. He was a man who lived by the sun, by the order of words and the light of a lamp, and he was now in a world of darkness and chaos, a world of shadows and unseen dangers, and he had to fight the urge to climb back up, to run back into the dangerous, but familiar, world of the streets. But he thought of the snake on the ring, of the cold, hard eyes of the men who had hunted him, and he knew he had no choice. He had to go on. He walked, his hands outstretched, touching the cold, slimy walls of the tunnel, his feet splashing in the shallow, foul-smelling water, and he walked for what felt like an eternity, the darkness pressing in on him, the silence broken only by the sound of his own desperate breathing. And then, in the distance, he saw a light, a single, flickering flame, and he moved toward it, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear, and as he got closer, he saw a woman, an old woman with a face as wrinkled as a dried fig, her hair a wild gray mess, her clothes nothing but tattered rags, and she was sitting on a small, dry piece of stone, a single, guttering torch in her hand, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the tunnel, and she was surrounded by scrolls, not the clean, perfect scrolls of a public library, but old, dirty, water-stained scrolls, their edges frayed and torn, their words a faint, almost invisible whisper on the papyrus. Gaius stopped a few feet away, his mind reeling with the sight of her, the smell of her, the utter, complete strangeness of the scene, and she looked up, her eyes, two pools of dark, ancient knowledge, fixed on his, and she did not speak, she just watched him, her gaze so piercing it felt like a physical touch, as if she could see every lie he had ever told, every truth he had ever hidden, and she knew everything about him. "You are not from here," she said at last, her voice a low, gravelly whisper, a voice that seemed to come from the very stones of the sewer, a voice that held no warmth, no welcome, but a great and terrible authority. "You are a man of the surface. You are lost." Gaius, his voice a dry, thin rasp, could only say, "I am a scribe. I am in danger. I am looking for the oracle." The woman's lips, a thin, colorless line, curved into a small, humorless smile. "You have found her, little scribe. But you have brought the shadows with you. They follow you like a loyal dog." Gaius felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. How did you know?" he asked, his voice shaking, and the woman, the oracle, laughed, a sound that was more like the rattling of dry bones. "I do not know, I see. I see the sickness that has infected the heart of Rome. I see the serpent's embrace. It is everywhere. It is in the Senate, in the courts, in the homes of the wealthy. They believe they are saving Rome, but they are only killing it, one truth at a time." Her words were a chilling confirmation of his own terrible knowledge, and he felt a new wave of respect for this strange, powerful woman, this creature of the dark who saw what the men of the surface refused to see. He told her his story, of the farmer, of the forged documents, of the senator, of the symbol, of his foolish quest for justice, and of his desperate flight into the dark, and she listened, her eyes never leaving his, a strange, knowing silence that was more powerful than any words. When he was done, she was silent for a long time, and then she said, "You are a fool, little scribe. You tried to fight a monster with a single word. You tried to fight a tidal wave with a single stone. But you are a fool with a purpose. And in this city of shadows, a fool with a purpose is a dangerous thing." She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, and she walked over to a pile of her scrolls, her hands rummaging through the dusty, torn papyrus, and she pulled out a single, small scroll, its edges blackened, as if it had been burned, and she held it out to him. "This is a map," she said, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "A map of the serpent's embrace. It is a map of their lairs, their safe houses, their hidden doors. It is a map of the shadows that run beneath the city. Cato, the man who was meant to warn you, was one of my children. He was an archivist for them, a man who saw the truth, but did not have the courage to act. He died a hero's death, trying to get you this map. He died so that you might have a chance. Gaius took the scroll, the papyrus feeling like a heavy, cold weight in his hands, and he looked at the oracle, his eyes wide with a new, terrible understanding. So Cato was not a coward, he said, his voice full of a sudden, profound sadness. He was a hero. The oracle nodded, a slow, solemn movement. They all are, the ones who try to fight them. They are all heroes. And they all die. But you are different. You are not a hero. You are a ghost. And a ghost can do things a hero cannot. She turned and walked into the darkness of the tunnel, her torch casting a flickering light behind her, and her voice, now a distant whisper, drifted back to him. The truth is not always found in the light, little scribe. Sometimes it is found in the dark. Go now. Go and find a new home. Go and learn to be a ghost. For the serpent's embrace will not rest until you are found. And they will look for you in the light. They will never think to look for you in the shadows. Gaius stood in the darkness, the map in his hand, and he knew his life as a scribe was over, and his life as a creature of the dark had just begun. He had found the oracle, but he had not found salvation. He had found a new, terrible purpose, a new, terrible life. He had a map of the shadows, and now he had to learn to read it out, a terrible truth that settled into Gaius's bones as he stood in the cold, damp darkness of the sewer, the small, scorched scroll feeling impossibly heavy in his hand, a burden of knowledge that could either save him, or lead him to his final, terrible end. He unrolled the map with a trembling hand, holding it close to the faint, residual light from the oracle's departed torch, its lines and symbols a chaotic and foreign language to a man who had only ever read the precise and ordered Latin of the law. The map was not a drawing of streets or buildings, but a web of lines, of small, strange symbols, of dots and triangles and intersecting lines, a secret geometry of the city's underbelly, a world that existed parallel to the realm of the sun and the stone. There were symbols for hidden passages, for secret rooms beneath the public baths, for forgotten tunnels that led from one side of the city to another, and at the center of it all, a single, large, and terrifying symbol, a coiled snake, the same symbol he had seen on the ring of the powerful man in the market, the same symbol that had marked the death of the farmer, and the end of his own life as a scribe. The snake was at the center of the forum, right beneath the Senate building, a chilling, physical representation of a spiritual and political truth. The serpent's embrace was at the very heart of the empire, a poison that ran through its veins. Gaius knew he could not stay where he was. The oracle had said they were looking for him, and though the sewers were her world, they were not his, and he felt a cold dread at the thought of the creatures that lived in the dark, and the men who might have followed him. He had to move. He began to trace the lines on the map with his finger, searching for a path that would lead him out of this section of the sewers and toward a safer, more hidden part of the city. He found a line that led toward a series of 3 dots, a symbol he guessed meant a series of hidden doors or passages, and he began to walk, his hands outstretched, his eyes fixed on the map, his mind a desperate whirlwind of fear and a grim, cold determination. He walked for what felt like hours, the darkness unbroken, the silence only interrupted by the sound of his own breathing, and he was guided not by sight, but by touch, by the feel of the cold, slimy walls beneath his fingertips, by the small bumps and irregularities that the map had marked. He found the first dot, a small, half-hidden alcove in the wall, a place where a man could stand and be completely invisible, and he felt a surge of a new kind of power, the power of a ghost, the power of a man who could vanish at will. He found the second dot, a small, round drain pipe that led into a different tunnel, a tunnel that was even smaller and darker, and he squeezed himself through, his body a tight, aching mess, and he was on a different path, a new part of the shadow world. He found the third dot, a small, loose stone in the wall, and he pushed it, the stone giving way with a soft grinding sound, and as he stepped through, he was in a completely new place. He was in the dark, silent space beneath the great Roman baths, a place of hot, humid air and the constant, echoing sound of dripping water, a place of great, massive stone columns and intricate carvings, a place that was hidden from the sun but was as beautiful in its own way as the buildings above. He was in the shadow world, a world where he could be safe, for now, a world that was a beautiful and terrible contradiction. He found a small, dry place to rest, a small, high ledge where he could sit and be unseen, and he closed his eyes, his mind replaying the events of the last few days, and he felt a deep, profound sadness. He had lost his home, his job, his life, and his belief in a just and ordered world, and all he had in return was a map of the shadows and a terrible, chilling truth. He thought of the senator, the man who was the serpent's head, and he felt a cold, quiet rage. He had to expose him. He had to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost, not for himself, but for the ghost of the farmer, Quintus, and for the ghost of Cato, the gentle archivist who had died for him. He had a purpose, a new purpose, and in the darkness of the baths, he was no longer a fool, but a man with a mission. He knew that the only way to fight a shadow was with another shadow, and he had to learn the secrets of the map, the secrets of the city's underbelly, to become the ghost that would one day haunt the serpent's embrace. He spent the next few days in the darkness, a creature of the night, a silent, unseen observer. He learned to read the map, to understand the secret language of its lines and symbols, to know where the hidden doors were, where the secret passages led, and where the patrols of the serpent's embrace were weakest. He learned to move in the dark, to be silent, to become a part of the shadows, and his body, once so soft and unused to physical labor, grew strong and agile. His mind, once so focused on the order of words, now sharp and quick, a mind that could read the subtle signs of danger, the almost imperceptible changes in the sounds of the night. He found a source of food, a small, almost invisible hole that led to the kitchen of a wealthy domus, and he learned to steal, to take what he needed without being seen, a crime he would have condemned in his old life. But now, it was a necessity, a way to survive, a small act of rebellion against the system that had taken everything from him. He even saw them, the men of the embrace, their cold, hard eyes scanning the streets, their powerful figures moving with a quiet, menacing authority, and he watched them from the shadows, a ghost in the city, and he knew that they would never find him, not in the light, not in the streets, for he was in the dark, a creature of the shadows, and he was learning to be a hunter. Gaius knew he could not hide forever. The serpent's embrace would not rest until he was found, and the longer he waited, the more desperate their search would become. He had to act. He had to use the knowledge he had gained from the map and from his time in the shadows to strike at the heart of their power, to expose the truth, to bring them out of the dark and into the light. He began to plan his attack, his mind, once so focused on the precise and ordered rules of the law, now a devious and dangerous engine of rebellion. He found a secret passage that led from the baths directly to the base of the Senate building, a path that was not on any of the public maps, a path that only the serpent's embrace, and now him, knew about. He decided that his target would be the senator, the serpent's head, the man who was the face of the corruption. He would not kill him. He was not a killer. He was a man of words, and his weapon would be the truth, a truth that would be far more deadly than any sword. He would expose him in the middle of a public hearing, in the very place where the laws of Rome were supposed to be sacred, in the very place where the serpent's embrace had built its power. He would use the hidden passage to get into the Senate, to get close to the senator, and with the evidence from the now burned scroll, the knowledge that had been etched into his mind, he would speak, he would tell the world the truth, he would expose the rot that had infected the heart of Rome. It was a foolish, desperate plan, a plan that would almost certainly get him killed, but it was his only chance, his only way to find justice, to find some meaning in the terrible, violent end of his old life. He was no longer Gaius, the scribe. He was a ghost with a purpose, a man who lived in the shadows and was about to bring the truth to the light, no matter the cost. A terrifying and liberating transformation that had taken root in the damp, dark tunnels beneath Rome, where the silence of the sewers had become his sanctuary and the ancient, foul-smelling stone his classroom, teaching him a new, brutal language of survival that had nothing to do with the elegant curves of a reed pen and everything to do with the hard, cold reality of a world that had forgotten the meaning of justice. His plan was a reckless, desperate gamble, a single, all-or-nothing moment of truth that he had meticulously planned in the silent solitude of the hidden passages beneath the city, using the oracle's map as his holy text and the constant, nagging fear of capture as his terrible inspiration. And he knew that every single detail had to be perfect, for a single misstep would not only mean his death but the final, complete burial of the truth he had risked everything to save. For 2 days he had traced the path on the oracle's map, a winding, convoluted line that led from the safety of the public baths to the very heart of the Roman Republic, the Senate building, a place he had only ever seen from the outside, a place he was now about to enter as a phantom, a living testament to the corruption that lay beneath its polished marble floors. He had studied the map's intricate symbols, memorizing the locations of the hidden doors, the secret levers, the weak points in the stone, and he had learned to move with the quiet, effortless grace of a creature of the dark, his footsteps making no sound, his presence leaving no trace, a true ghost in the city's underbelly. He had even found a small, rusted iron bar in a forgotten storeroom, a crude weapon that felt both heavy and ridiculously insufficient in his hand. But it was his only defense, his final, desperate answer to the swords of the serpent's embrace. The night before his planned attack, he had felt a strange, detached calm, a peacefulness that had replaced the gnawing fear, the terrible realization that he was no longer a man with a choice but a man with a purpose, and his fate, whether it was death or a fragile, temporary victory, was no longer in his hands but in the hands of the gods. He waited for the right moment, for the perfect alignment of events that the map had foretold, a small, forgotten ritual that the serpent's embrace used to mark the beginning of their most important meetings, a signal that was not a sound, but a feeling, a change in the air, a subtle shift in the silence of the sewers, and he knew, with a certainty that was both chilling and exhilarating, that the time had come. He began his journey, his body a wire of tense, coiled energy, his mind a sharp, focused instrument of his will, and he moved through the dark tunnels with a new, terrifying confidence, the familiar stench of the sewers now a comforting aroma, the constant scuttling of the unseen creatures now a kind of terrible, wild music that he had learned to understand. He navigated the twisting, narrow passages, his hand always on the cold, damp stone of the walls, his mind picturing the map, the lines and symbols and dots, and he passed the patrol of the embrace, their torches casting a flickering, dancing light on the walls, their low, conspiratorial whispers a language he now understood, and he stayed in the deep, unmoving shadows, a part of the darkness. A man who had vanished in a world that did not want to be seen. He came to the hidden passage that led to the Senate, a large, heavy stone door that was perfectly disguised as a part of the wall, and he found the small, almost invisible indentation that the map had marked, and he pressed it, the stone giving way with a soft, grinding noise, and he stepped through, the air growing warmer, the sounds of the sewers giving way to the faint, muffled sounds of the city above, and he was in the heart of Rome. But still in the dark, still a ghost. He was in a small, damp storeroom, a place where the senators kept their old scrolls and documents, a place that was just a few feet beneath the polished marble floor of the Senate building, and he could hear their voices above him, a low, constant murmur of power and politics, and he knew that his moment had come. He found the secret entrance to the Senate floor, a small, cleverly disguised grate hidden beneath a pile of old scrolls, and he pushed it, the grate swinging open with a small, almost inaudible squeak, and as he peered out, he saw it, the forum, a great, circular room filled with the senators in their togas, their faces a sea of white and gold, and at the center of it all, standing on a raised platform, was the senator. The serpent's head, a man who looked so powerful and so righteous that Gaius almost doubted his own knowledge, almost questioned the truth that had cost him everything, but then he saw the small, silver ring on the senator's finger, a small snake curled around a single, elegant letter T, and the anger, the cold, quiet rage, returned, and he knew, with a terrible certainty, that the man was a monster, a poison at the very heart of the empire. Gaius waited for his moment, for the brief, quiet pause in the endless debates, and then, with a single, quick motion, he pushed himself up, the grate closing with a soft, almost imperceptible click, and he was on the Senate floor, a ghost in a place of life and power, a man of the shadows standing in the light. For a moment, no one saw him. They were all focused on the senator, their heads bowed, their ears open to his words of wisdom and power, and Gaius stood, his body still and silent, his hands clenched into fists, the small, rusted iron bar a useless weight in his hand, and he knew that his weapon was not the iron, but the words, the truth that he had risked everything to save. He took a deep breath, and his voice, which had been a low, raspy whisper for days, rose, strong and clear and full of a terrible, righteous fury, a single, powerful sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd, a sound that stopped them all in their tracks. "Tiberius!" Gaius shouted, his voice echoing in the great, circular hall, a single, foreign sound that was more shocking and more terrifying than any war horn, and every head turned, every eye, every cold, unblinking gaze was fixed on him, a small, dirty man in a tattered tunic, a man who had no place in a world of power and wealth, and Tiberius, the senator, the serpent's head, saw him, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, his face, so accustomed to the mask of power and authority, was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, a single, perfect expression of a man who had just seen a ghost, and Gaius felt a surge of triumph, a rush of cold, quiet victory. "You are not a man of law!" Gaius screamed, his voice now a terrible, raw sound of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You are a thief! You use the laws of Rome as a weapon, as a shield for your terrible crimes. You steal land from the poor, from the farmers, from the old centurions. You murder those who get in your way. I have seen the truth. I have seen the forged documents. I have seen the witnesses you paid to lie. You are not a man of Rome. You are a parasite. And the snake you wear on your finger is not a symbol of power, but a symbol of the poison you have brought to the very heart of this empire." The words, so long and so carefully hidden, came pouring out of him, a torrent of righteous anger, a river of truth that was now flowing into a world of lies, and the senators, the men of power, were silent, their faces a strange, terrifying mix of shock and confusion, and they looked at each other, their eyes wide, their minds reeling from the impossible accusations that had just been spoken in a place where lies were the very foundation of power. But the silence did not last. The men of the embrace, their eyes now cold and hard, their hands moving to the hilts of their swords, began to move, a slow, quiet, menacing circle drawing around Gaius, and Tiberius, the shock now gone from his face, replaced by a terrible, cold fury, raised his hand and pointed a single, trembling finger at Gaius. "He is a man, the senator roared, his voice a powerful, authoritative sound that washed over the whispers and the murmurs of the crowd. "He is a spy, a barbarian. He has no place in the Senate. Seize him! Seize him now!" And the men of the embrace, their eyes fixed on Gaius, began to close in, their hands now on their swords, their faces a mask of cold, terrible purpose, and Gaius, a man of words who had just used his last one, knew that his time was up. He threw the small, rusted iron bar at the senator's feet, a last, defiant act of a man who had brought a knife to a sword fight, and he stood, his head held high, his eyes fixed on Tiberius, and he felt a strange, cold calm, the peaceful acceptance of a man who had done all he could do, a man who had given his life for a single, small moment of truth, and as the men of the embrace closed in, their hands reaching out to grab him, to silence him, to bury him and the truth forever, a low, terrible murmur rose from the senators, a murmur of fear, a murmur of doubt, and Gaius smiled, a ghost of a smile, and he knew, with a certainty that was more powerful than any sword, that even if he was silenced, the truth had been spoken, and the poison, the terrible, bitter poison of a single word, had now begun to infect the very heart of the empire. The men of the embrace, their hands now on their swords, their faces a mask of cold, terrible purpose, closed in on Gaius, but the poison, the terrible, bitter poison of a single word, had now begun to infect the very heart of the empire, a poison that had no antidote, a truth so sharp it cut through the thick veil of lies and hypocrisy that had held the Senate together for so long, and the senators, the powerful men who governed Rome, did not move, their feet rooted to the polished marble floor, their eyes wide with a strange, terrifying mix of shock and confusion. For they had just witnessed an impossible act, an act of rebellion so profound it defied all logic and all law. A single, insignificant man in a tattered tunic had just dared to speak the unspeakable, to call a powerful and respected senator a liar and a thief in the very chamber where the laws of Rome were sacred, and the silence, the profound, terrible silence that followed Gaius's final words, was not the silence of a man caught, but the silence of an entire system of power caught in the act of its own corruption. Senator Antoninus, An old man with a face as wrinkled and as noble as the hills of Rome, a man who had served the Republic for 50 years, a man who had seen everything, felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach, for he had heard the whispers, the vague, unsubstantiated rumors of powerful men using the courts to steal land, but he had dismissed them as the bitter complaints of the defeated. But now, looking at the small, dirty man in the center of the Senate floor, a man who had no reason to lie, a man who was about to die for his words, Antoninus felt a terrible, chilling certainty that the words were true, that the rot was deeper than anyone had imagined, that the law, the beautiful, perfect machine he had dedicated his life to, was not a shield for justice, but a weapon for the corrupt, and he saw, with a terrible, crystal clarity, the snake on Tiberius's ring. A symbol he had always dismissed as a strange, personal affectation, but now, it was a brand of shame, a mark of a secret, terrible power that had been hiding in plain sight for decades, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the corruption was not the disease, it was the cure, a cure they believed was necessary to save Rome from its own weaknesses, and he was a weakness that had to be cut out, and a small, quiet, powerful voice in the back of Antoninus's mind, a voice he had not heard in a very long time. A voice that was the voice of the old Republic, told him to act, to do something, to not let the truth be buried with this brave, foolish man. But the men of the embrace were closer, their movements a slow, deliberate tightening of a noose, their cold, hard eyes fixed on Gaius, and Tiberius, the senator, his face now a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, gave a single, imperceptible nod, a command to his loyal dogs to silence the truth forever, and the two men at the front of the circle, their hands on their swords, lunged forward, a quick, silent rush of motion, but Gaius, the scribe who had learned to move like a ghost, did not run. He did not fight, he did not scream, he did something entirely unexpected. He dropped to his knees, his hands flat on the polished marble floor, and he whispered, a sound so low it was almost inaudible. The poison is in the stones. And he saw a flicker of confusion on the faces of the men, a moment of hesitation, a question in their eyes, and it was all the time he needed. He had not spent a week in the bowels of the city for nothing, he had not just learned to be a ghost, he had learned the language of the stones, the secret vibrations that told him where a passage was hollow, where a weak spot in the ancient foundation lay, and with a quick, powerful shove, he pushed his hands against the floor, a perfectly timed movement that was not a fight, but an act of sabotage, and the stone, the great, heavy marble that had held the Senate for centuries, gave way with a terrible, grinding roar, a single, perfectly placed towel collapsing inward, and the two men who had lunged for him, their feet no longer on solid ground, plunged into the dark, echoing abyss below, their screams a terrible, final testament to their arrogance. The roar of the collapsing stone, the terrible, echoing sound of the men's screams, sent a wave of pure, chaotic terror through the Senate, and the senators, the men of power and order, scattered like a flock of birds, their dignity and their authority forgotten in the face of this impossible, terrifying disruption, a single, physical manifestation of the truth Gaius had just spoken. That the very foundation of their world was rotten, that the poison was in the stones, and in the chaos, in the confusion, in the terrified stampede. Gaius, a man who had once been a scribe, was a ghost once more, and he vanished. He scrambled into the dark, foul-smelling hole he had created, the sounds of panic and chaos from the Senate floor now a muffled, distant memory, a beautiful, terrible symphony of his success, and he landed in the cold, damp mud of the sewer, a world that was now more a home to him than the city above, a world where the shadows were his allies and the darkness his sanctuary, and he did not stop, he did not rest. He did not even look back, for he knew that the chaos would not last, that the embrace would soon recover, their anger and their determination now 1,000 times more fierce, their hunt now personal, and he was no longer just a man who knew their secret, he was a man who had publicly humiliated their leader and killed 2 of their own, and they would not rest, they would not sleep, they would not stop until they found him. He moved through the tunnels with a new, urgent purpose, his feet splashing in the shallow, foul-smelling water, his hands outstretched, touching the cold, slimy walls, his mind picturing the map, the lines and symbols and dots, a new, terrible, and beautiful map that had been etched into his very soul, a map of escape and a map of revenge, and he knew that the oracle's words were true. He was a ghost, a creature of the dark. And they would look for him in the light, in the streets, in the homes of his friends and his family. But they would never think to look for him in the shadows. They would never think to look for him in the rot and the filth that was the true heart of Rome. He found the familiar passage that led back to the baths, a journey that had once taken him hours now taking only minutes, for he was a master of the darkness now, a master of a world they did not even know existed, and as he stepped out of the sewer and into the humid, echoing silence of the underground baths, he felt a strange, cold sense of triumph, a victory that was a bitter and lonely thing, for he had won. He had exposed the truth, but he had lost everything in the process, and he was alone, a ghost in the world, with only a map of shadows and a terrible, chilling truth for company. But in the Senate, the chaos had begun to subside. The senators, their dignity slowly returning, their minds trying to make sense of the impossible events they had just witnessed, and Tiberius, his face now a mask of controlled rage, was trying to reassert his authority, to spin a story of a madman, of a barbarian spy, of a dangerous criminal who had been brought into the sacred halls of the Republic by unseen forces. But the lie felt hollow, the words felt weak, for they had all heard Gaius's words, they had all seen the single, terrible act of sabotage, the poison in the stones, and in the hearts of the senators, a single, tiny seed of doubt had been planted, a doubt that would one day grow into a terrible, all-consuming question. Senator Antoninus, the old man, stood in the chaos, his mind reeling, his eyes still fixed on the hole in the floor, the dark, echoing chasm where the two men had fallen, and he knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that the man in the tattered tunic was not a madman, not a barbarian, but a messenger of the truth, a ghost who had come from the shadows to warn them of the rot that was in the very foundation of their world. And Antoninus knew that he could not ignore it, he could not unsee what he had seen, he could not unhear what he had heard, and he made a decision, a quiet, dangerous decision that would change the course of his life and the course of the Republic, a decision to find the truth, to go to the shadows, to find the ghost who had warned them, and to do what he could to fight the poison, to fight the embrace, and in the mind of the old senator, a new, terrible war had just begun. He would not use swords or armies, but a new kind of weapon, a weapon of whispers and secrets, a weapon of truth, and he knew that the hunt for Gaius, the ghost, had just begun, but this time, the hunt was not a hunt to kill, but a hunt to save, a terrible, dangerous alliance that had just been formed in the dark, and Gaius, a man alone in the sewers, a man with a map and a terrible, chilling purpose, did not know it. But he was no longer alone. And in the darkness, in the quiet, damp silence of the sewers, Gaius, a man who had once been a scribe, a man who had now become a ghost, sat, his back against a cold, slimy wall, his mind a whirlwind of thought and a maelstrom of emotion, the bitter taste of victory and the cold, terrible knowledge of what he had lost, and he knew that his old life was gone forever. That the beautiful machine of law and order he had once so naively believed in was a lie, a terrible, cynical lie that had been built on the broken bodies of men like Quintus, and on the bones of men like Cato, and on the corruption that had become the law itself, and he was a man who had seen the truth, a man who had tried to fight it with a single word, and now, he was a ghost, a creature of the dark, and the hunt had begun. The men of the Embrace, a vast, powerful organization, were searching for him, and he knew they would not stop. But he also knew that he had a map of their shadows, a knowledge of their secrets. And he was no longer just a victim, he was a man with a purpose, a man who had nothing left to lose, and in the darkness, in the terrible, quiet silence of the sewers, Gaius, the ghost, smiled, a cold, hard, and terrifying smile, and he knew that his war was just beginning. He had a map of the shadows, and now he would learn to use it not just for survival, but for retribution, for justice, for a war that would be fought not on the battlefields, but in the dark, twisting tunnels of Rome, a war that would be fought with whispers and secrets, a war between the light and the dark, a war between a man who had lost everything and an empire that was rotting from within. The stench of the sewers, the constant, scuttling sound of the unseen creatures, the dripping of the water, it was all a part of his new world, a world where he was a ghost, and the city above was his enemy. And the Senator Antoninus, a man of power and honor, a man who had just seen a ghost, a man who had been a part of the problem for so long, now found himself, in a single, terrifying moment, a part of the solution, a man who would use his power and his influence to fight a secret, terrible war that he had not known existed just minutes before, a war that would be fought in the shadows. A war that would be fought for the very soul of Rome. He would not go to the authorities, for he knew that the embrace was everywhere, that the poison had reached into the highest offices, that the police and the army were just tools of the corrupt, and he had to use his own influence, his own network of spies and informants, men and women who had whispered to him for years of strange, terrible things that were happening in the city's underbelly. Whispers he had always dismissed as the ramblings of the paranoid, but now, he knew they were the truth, a terrible, horrifying truth, and he knew that his mission, his only mission, was to find the ghost, to find the man who had risked everything to bring the truth to light, and to form an alliance, a dangerous, impossible alliance, a partnership between the light and the dark, a partnership between a man of the surface and a creature of the shadows, a partnership that would either save Rome or get them both killed. The hunt for Gaius had begun, and this time, the hunters were on the side of justice, a terrible, desperate hope in a city of shadows, and the future of the Republic, its very soul, now rested on a single, silent, terrible game of hide and seek between a powerful man who had just seen the truth and a small, dirty man who had become a ghost. A man who had been a part of the problem for so long, now found himself, in a single, terrifying moment, a part of the solution, a man who would use his power and his influence to fight a secret, terrible war that he had not known existed just minutes before, a war that would be fought in the shadows, a war that would be fought for the very soul of Rome, a terrifying and liberating truth that settled into his old, weary bones as he stood amidst the chaos of the Senate floor, the senators, his colleagues, still reeling from the impossible, terrifying spectacle of a man rising from the ground, shouting the truth, and then vanishing into the very same hole, a hole that was now a chasm of doubt in the polished, gilded heart of the Republic. Antoninus did not wait for the chaos to subside, for the guards to arrive, for the official narrative to be spun. He slipped away, his old legs moving with a speed he had not known he possessed, his mind a whirlwind of thought, the terrible, chilling certainty that the man, the ghost, was not a madman but a messenger, a warning. A living testament to a corruption so vast and so hidden that it could use the very stones of Rome as its shield, a corruption that wore the face of his friend, Senator Tiberius, a man he had trusted, a man who was now the face of a terrible lie. Antoninus, a man of the light, a man of public life and grand speeches, knew that his old ways were useless, that he could not fight this war with the law, for the law was their weapon, and he could not fight it with the public truth, for the public would not believe, they would call him madman, they would call him a traitor, and so, he had to go to the shadows, to learn their language, to use the tools of a world he had always avoided. To become a hunter not of men, but of a ghost who held the key to the truth, and the key to his own salvation. He went not to his villa, but to a small, unassuming taberna in the Subura, a place of low talk and cheap wine, a place where he would never be seen, and he met with his most trusted servant, a small, quiet man named Servius, who was not just a servant but a master of the city's whispers, a man who knew the language of the alleyways and the secrets of the beggars and the thieves. A man who had been his eyes and ears in a world he had always been too noble to see. Servius, his face a mask of concern, listened as Antoninus spoke of the impossible, of a man who rose from the floor of the Senate, of the terrible, damning words, of the chasm in the marble, and of the snake on Tiberius's ring, a symbol Servius had seen before, whispered about in the lowest parts of the city, a symbol of a power so vast and so cruel that even the thieves and the cutthroats feared it, a power they called the embrace. And Servius, with a cold, terrifying certainty, knew that his master had just stepped into a world of death, and he was no longer just a servant, he was a silent partner in a war against a ghost, a war to find a truth that was more deadly than any sword. They began their hunt, a quiet, methodical search that was the antithesis of the public, bombastic life Antoninus had always known. Servius spoke to his contacts, to the beggars who sat by the fountains, to the slaves who worked in the kitchens, to the prostitutes who saw everything, and he pieced together a single, impossible story of a scribe, a man named Gaius, who had vanished from his home, who was now living in the shadows, a man who had, for a few hours, been seen in the streets wearing a tattered tunic and a face smeared with mud. And the story of the burning scroll, the single act of rebellion against a powerful enemy, began to take shape, a whisper of a man who was fighting a war he could not win, a war he had to win alone. Antoninus, in the meantime, used his own network, a network of powerful men who were not part of the embrace, men who were too old or too honorable to be corrupted, men who had seen the same cracks in the foundation of Rome, but who had never known what they meant, and he spoke to them in hushed, secret conversations, in the back rooms of villas, in the quiet corners of temples, and he told them the truth, the impossible, terrifying truth of the serpent's embrace, and he asked for their help. For their spies, for their resources, for their willingness to fight a ghost with a man who had just seen one. While the men of the light search, Gaius, in the depths of the sewers, was becoming more than a ghost, he was becoming a predator, a creature of the dark who knew the language of the shadows better than the language of the law. He had found a new home in a forgotten cistern beneath the Forum, a place of constant, echoing water and a strange, comforting darkness, a place where he was truly safe, a place where the embrace would never think to look, and he spent his days studying the oracle's map, his mind a new, sharp instrument of his will, memorizing every hidden door, every secret passage, every weakness in the great, beautiful machine of Rome. And he began to plan his next move, a plan not of defense, but of attack. He had planted a seed of truth in the Senate. But a seed was not enough, he had to water it, he had to make it grow, he had to give Antoninus, the man he did not know was on his side, the evidence he needed to expose the entire, terrible network. But he had to be careful. The embrace would be searching for him now with a new, brutal urgency. They would not only be looking in the streets, but in the sewers as well, for they would have realized that he was not a man, but a man who had a terrible, dangerous knowledge, and they would be using their own shadow world to hunt him, a world of their own spies and their own loyal dogs. And so, Gaius, the predator, had to be a ghost once more, a ghost who was hunting his hunters. He spent weeks in the shadows, a silent, unseen observer, watching the movements of the embrace, learning their patterns, their rituals, their weaknesses. He saw their messengers, their go-betweens, the men and women who carried their secrets, and he began to follow them, a silent, unseen shadow, a man who was no longer just a victim but a hunter of the dark, and he found their lairs, their hidden meeting places, their safe houses, the places that were marked on the oracle's map, and he found a new sense of purpose, a cold, hard determination to bring them all down, one lie at a time, one secret at a time. He saw a man, a powerful merchant named Lentulus, a man who was known for his piety and his generous donations to the temples, a man who was, according to the map, a key member of the embrace, and he followed him, a silent, unseen shadow, to a small, unassuming shop near the Forum, a shop that sold expensive silks and perfumes, and he watched as Lentulus slipped into the back, and he saw, with a chilling certainty, that the shop was just a front for one of the embrace's secret meeting places. Gaius knew he had to get in, to find the evidence he needed, to find the list of names, the documents, the proof that would convince Antoninus and the rest of the world that the man was a monster. He waited for the right moment, for the dead of night, for a time when the streets were silent and the city was asleep, and he used his knowledge of the shadows, his knowledge of the secret passages, and he slipped into the building, a ghost in the night, a man who was about to risk everything, again, for a truth that no one wanted to believe. He found the secret door that the map had marked, a small, unassuming panel in the wall, and he slid it open, the old wood groaning in protest, and he was in a dark, silent chamber, a place of desks and scrolls and books, a place that was a library of secrets, a place that was the heart of the embrace's power, and he began to search, his hands trembling, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, his mind a whirlwind of fear and a fragile, burning hope. He found it. A small, locked iron chest, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and he knew, with a certainty that was both chilling and exhilarating, that the truth was in that chest, the list of names, the documents, the proof that would bring down the entire, terrible network, and he had to get it open, he had to get it out, he had to get it to Antoninus, to a man he did not know was on his side. He used a piece of rusted iron he had found in the sewers, a crude tool that was a strange and terrible key, and he forced the lock, the iron groaning in protest, and he opened the chest, the hinges squealing, and he saw it, a single, perfect list of names, a list of senators, of merchants, of judges, of powerful men and women, and at the top of the list, a single, terrible name, Tiberius, the senator. The serpent's head, and next to it, a single, chilling word, founder. Gaius, his hands shaking, his mind reeling with the enormity of the discovery, took the scroll, a heavy, cold weight in his hands, and he began to retrace his steps, to go back into the shadows, to go back to the sewers, to go back to the safety of the dark. But as he reached the secret door, he heard a sound, a quiet, metallic clink from the street above, and he froze, his heart a hammer against his ribs. His mind screaming that they had found him, that he was too late, that the hunt was over. He pressed himself against the wall, a part of the darkness, and he waited, his breath a silent, desperate whisper, and he saw a single ray of light from a flickering torch, a light that cut through the darkness, and he saw two figures, their faces hidden in the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate, and he knew they were not the men of the embrace, they were not the hunters, but the hunted, the men who had been sent to find him. The men who were on Antoninus's side. He saw the face of Servius, the servant, his eyes scanning the shadows, and he saw the face of another man, a strong, silent man with a face as hard as stone, a man he had never seen before, a man who was a shadow in the light, a man who was a hunter of the dark, a man who was an ally, and in that moment, in the cold, silent darkness of the secret chamber, Gaius, the ghost, knew that he was no longer alone. That the hunt was over, and the war was just beginning. He stepped out of the shadows, the scroll in his hand, a man who had lost everything, but a man who had found a purpose, and he met the gaze of Servius, the servant of the light, and he knew that their alliance, a dangerous, impossible alliance, a partnership between a man of the surface and a creature of the shadows, was the last, best hope for the Republic. A terrifying and fragile partnership forged in the dark. A truth that hung in the cold, silent air of the secret chamber, a space that was no longer a tomb of secrets, but a nexus of two disparate worlds, and Gaius, the ghost, the man who had lost everything, saw in the eyes of Servius not just a servant, but an equal, a man who had seen the same corruption, the same terrible, soul-crushing lies, and had made the same brave, terrifying choice to fight, to stand against a power so vast and so cruel it had been able to hide in plain sight for decades. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Gaius felt a surge of a new kind of power, a power not of fear or of desperation, but a power of shared purpose, a power that came from the knowledge that he was no longer alone, that his war was not a lonely battle but a terrible, desperate alliance against an enemy that was everywhere. Servius, for his part, saw in Gaius not a man, but a legend, a creature of the dark who had risen from the muck of the sewers, a living testament to a truth that was more powerful than any lie, and he saw, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that this small, dirty man was not just a symbol of the war, but the very weapon that would win it, a living, breathing map of the shadows. A ghost who had the courage to fight a battle that no one else had even known was being waged. They did not speak. Words were not needed in this world of shadows and secrets. Servius simply extended his hand, and Gaius, the scroll, the terrible, damning list of names, in his other, met his gaze with a cold, hard, and terrifying understanding, and their hands met, a silent, powerful promise of a partnership that would either save Rome or get them both killed, and then, without a word, they began to move, a silent, efficient trio, a ghost, a servant, and a man who was a shadow in the light. A trio of improbable allies who were now a single, terrifying force of rebellion. They moved through the city's underbelly, a world that was as foreign to Servius as the moon, but a world that Gaius navigated with the quiet, effortless grace of a master, a man who had not just learned to live in the shadows, but had become them, and Servius, watching him, felt a new wave of respect for this man, this ghost, this creature of the dark who was a living testament to the truth. They came to a small, unassuming taberna, the very one where Antoninus had been waiting, and as they entered, the old senator, his face a mask of worry, saw them, saw the look in their eyes, and he knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that the hunt was over, and the war had just begun. He did not ask for the scroll. He did not ask for the names. He simply looked at Gaius, at this small, dirty man who had just risked his life for a truth he had not even known existed just days before, and he said, his voice low and full of a terrible reverence, "The truth has been spoken. And now, we must fight for it." And so, the alliance was complete, a partnership between a man of the light, a man of power and honor, and a man of the shadows, a man who was a living weapon, and a servant who was a master of the city's whispers, a partnership that would fight a secret, terrible war for the very soul of the Republic. Their first move was not to expose the list of names, not to bring the truth to the public, for they knew that such a move would be suicide, a single, powerful act of rebellion that the Embrace would crush with a quiet, terrible efficiency. But instead, their first move was to prepare for the long war, to gather the resources, to find the allies, to build the network of spies and informants that would be their only chance against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, an enemy that wore the face of their friends and their family, an enemy that had built its power on the foundation of the very republic it claimed to protect. Antoninus used his influence, his old, reliable network of powerful men who had seen the same cracks in the foundation, but who had never known what they meant, and he showed them the list, the terrible, chilling list of names, and the men, their faces a mask of shock and a terrible, cold fury, were convinced, and they pledged their support, their spies, their resources, their willingness to fight a war they had not known existed just days before. Gaius, the ghost, used his knowledge of the shadows, his knowledge of the oracle's map, his knowledge of the Embrace's secret lairs and hidden meeting places, and he began to train their spies, to teach them the language of the shadows, to teach them how to move unseen, how to become a part of the darkness, how to be a ghost in a city that was alive with a terrible, secret power. And Servius, the servant, used his network, his vast and intricate web of beggars and thieves and prostitutes and slaves, and he began to gather the whispers, the rumors, the small, seemingly insignificant pieces of information that would, when pieced together, form a perfect, damning picture of the Embrace's every move, their every plan, their every lie. They spent months in the shadows, a ghost, a servant, and a powerful senator, a partnership that was as strange and as beautiful as the city itself, and they were everywhere and nowhere, a silent, unseen rebellion that was gaining strength with every passing day, a network of spies and informants that was a perfect mirror of the Embrace, a terrible, beautiful irony that was not lost on Gaius. He, the man who had been so naive, so foolishly idealistic, was now a master of the very darkness he had once feared, a man who was a living weapon of the truth, a man who was fighting a war not for a public victory, but for a quiet, secret one, a victory of the shadows, a victory of the truth over the lie. They began to strike, not with violence, but with whispers, with rumors, with small, perfectly timed acts of sabotage that were designed to weaken the Embrace from within, to sow the seeds of doubt and fear in their own ranks. Gaius would use his knowledge of the shadows to slip into their hidden lairs, their secret meeting places, and he would steal their scrolls, their documents, their list of names, and he would leave behind a single, small, terrifying symbol, a single, perfect line of the letter T and a small, perfectly drawn snake, a symbol that told them that a ghost was watching, that a ghost knew their secrets, that a ghost was coming for them, and the Embrace, for the first time in its long, terrible history, was afraid. The whispers began to spread, a low, constant murmur in the high halls of the Senate and in the low taverns of the Subura, whispers of a ghost who was hunting the hunters, a ghost who was a living testament to a corruption so vast and so hidden that it could not be fought with swords, a ghost who was a creature of the dark, and the men of the Embrace, their faces a mask of fear, their eyes filled with a new, terrible terror, began to turn on each other, to suspect each other, to question the very power that had held them together for so long, and Tiberius, the senator, the serpent's head, a man who had always been so calm, so powerful, so in control, began to lose his grip on the beautiful, terrible machine he had built, and the poison of a single word, had now become a plague, a terrible, all-consuming illness that was eating the Embrace from within. The war was no longer just about Gaius. It was about the very soul of the Republic. It was about the men who had been a part of the problem for so long, the men who were now a part of the solution, the men who were fighting a terrible, secret war for the very soul of Rome. Gaius the ghost, a man who had once been a scribe, a man who had lost everything, was no longer just a victim. He was a hero. Not a hero of the light, but a hero of the shadows, a hero of the truth, a hero who had risked his life for a republic that had no idea he was even fighting for it. And in the darkness, in the cold, silent world of the sewers, a man who had been a fool was now a weapon, a man who had lost his name was now a legend, and he knew, with a certainty that was more powerful than any sword, that their war was not over, but that they were winning, one whisper at a time, one secret at a time, one ghost at a time. And the serpent's embrace, the beautiful, terrible machine that had once been so powerful, was now just a brittle, hollow thing, a relic of a world that was about to be destroyed by the very truth it had tried so hard to bury. And in the end, it was not a grand public trial, not a powerful, bombastic speech, not a single, decisive act of rebellion that brought down the embrace, but a quiet, methodical, and terrible war of attrition, a war that was fought in the shadows, a war that was won with whispers and secrets and a terrible, beautiful truth. Gaius, the ghost, had given Antoninus the evidence he needed, the scrolls, the documents, the lists of names, and Antoninus, a man of power and honor, had used his influence, his network of allies, his knowledge of the law, to bring down the embrace from within, to expose them not with a single, damning act, but with a series of quiet, perfectly timed acts of sabotage that were so subtle, so perfect, that the embrace had no idea what was happening until it was too late, until the poison had spread, until their own men were turning against them, until the fear and the doubt had become a terrible, all-consuming flame that had burned their entire network to the ground. Tiberius, the senator, the serpent's head, a man who had once been so powerful, so feared, was found dead in his villa, a single, small, perfectly drawn snake and a line of the letter T left on his desk, a final, terrible testament to the truth he had tried so hard to bury. And the public, the people of Rome, would never know the truth. They would never know that a small, dirty man, a ghost who had risen from the muck of the sewers, had saved their republic, for the war had been fought in the shadows, a secret, terrible war that had been won by a hero who would forever remain in the dark. Gaius, a man who had lost everything but had won the war, went back to the sewers, to the world he now called home, a man who was a legend in a world he had once feared, a man who was no longer just a scribe, no longer just a ghost, but a protector of the shadows, a guardian of the truth, a living testament to a war that had been fought and won, and in the quiet, damp silence of the sewers, a new, terrible, and beautiful life began for a man who had lost everything, but a man who had found a purpose, a man who had become a legend, a ghost who had saved a republic that had no idea it had been in danger. And the oracle, the woman who lived in the darkness, the woman who saw the truth, smiled, a thin, ancient, knowing smile, for she knew that the war was not over, that the embrace was a terrible, resilient thing, and that the shadows would always need a guardian, a ghost who would be there to fight for the truth. A chilling and prophetic truth that settled deep into Gaius's soul, a truth that was more powerful than any lie, more terrifying than any sword, a truth that was his new purpose, his new life, his new, terrible destiny. He was a man who had won a war, but a man who had no peace, a man who had found a purpose but had lost his name, a man who was no longer just a scribe, no longer just a ghost, but a protector of the shadows, a guardian of the truth, a living testament to a war that had been fought and won, and in the quiet, damp silence of the sewers, a new, terrible, and beautiful life began for a man who had lost everything but a man who had found a purpose, a man who had become a legend, a ghost who had saved a republic that had no idea it had been in danger. The city above him, the beautiful, terrible machine of Rome, continued to turn, its gears of power and politics, of wealth and corruption, of law and lies, a constant, low hum that Gaius, a creature of the dark, could feel in the very stones around him, and he knew that the silence of the sewers was not an end, but a beginning, a fragile, temporary truce in a war that would never truly be over. The embrace, the terrible, resilient thing that the oracle had warned him about, was a hydra, a monster that would grow 2 heads for every one that was cut off, and Gaius knew that his victory, the quiet, secret victory that had saved Rome from within, was just a small, almost imperceptible nick on the skin of a beast that was far, far more vast and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. He spent the next few months in a state of quiet, vigilant watchfulness, a silent, unseen guardian of a truth that no one wanted to believe, a man who had to learn a new kind of power, a power not of attack, but of defense, a power of patience, a power of waiting. He did not leave the sewers. They were his sanctuary, his new home, a world that was as foreign to the men of the light as the moon, but a world that was as familiar to him as the face of his own dead brother, and he moved through the dark tunnels with a new, quiet purpose, his mind always on the embrace, always on the hunt for the signs of its terrible, subtle resurgence. He saw the new men who had replaced the old, the new, young, ambitious men who were a part of the Hydra, a new, terrible generation of corruption that was a perfect mirror of the old, and he watched them from the shadows, a silent, unseen observer, a man who was a living testament to a war that was not over, a war that was just beginning, again. He found a new, terrible purpose, a new mission that was as vast and as terrible as the city itself, a mission to be the guardian of the shadows, to be the watcher, to be the ghost who would ensure that the terrible truth, the truth that he had risked everything to save, would never, ever be forgotten. He created a new network, a quiet, almost invisible network of his own, a network of the desperate, the disillusioned, the forgotten, the people who lived in the cracks of the city, the people who saw the lies and the corruption but who had no voice, no power, no way to fight back, and he spoke to them in whispers. He taught them the language of the shadows, he taught them to be ghosts, to be watchers, to be guardians of the truth. And his network grew, a silent, unseen rebellion that was a perfect mirror of the embrace, a terrible, beautiful irony that was not lost on him. He was no longer just Gaius. He was a name that was whispered in the low, shadowy taverns of the Subura, a name that was spoken in hushed, reverent tones, a name that was a living legend, a name that was a ghost, and the whispers, the low, constant murmur of a man who was a legend in a world he had once feared, began to reach the ears of the embrace, and they began to be afraid, again, not of a single man, but of an idea, of a ghost, of a terrible, resilient truth that they had tried so hard to bury. They sent their men into the sewers, their new, young, ambitious men, men who were as arrogant and as foolish as the old, and they looked for the ghost, they looked for the legend, they looked for the truth, but they did not find it, for they did not know the language of the shadows, they did not know the rules of a world that was as foreign to them as the moon, and they always came back empty-handed, their faces a mask of fear, their minds a whirlwind of confusion, and the embrace, for the first time in its long, terrible history, began to realize that their world of power and control was no longer a beautiful, terrible machine, but a fragile, brittle thing, a thing that was haunted by a ghost. And the oracle, the woman who lived in the darkness, the woman who saw the truth, would often find him, not in a new city, not in a new world, but in the depths of the sewers, in the quiet, damp silence of his new home, and she would simply sit beside him, a single, guttering torch in her hand, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, and they would not speak. For words were not needed in this world of shadows and secrets, but they would share a single, silent, terrible understanding, a partnership of two creatures of the dark, a partnership of a woman who saw the truth and a man who was its guardian, and the quiet, damp silence of the sewers, a world that was no longer a tomb of secrets, but a nexus of two disparate worlds, was their sanctuary, their new home, their new, terrible, and beautiful life, a life that was a constant, endless, and quiet war for the very soul of Rome. He had saved the Republic once, but he knew that his victory was a temporary one, a quiet, fragile peace in a war that would never truly be over, and he knew that his mission, his terrible, beautiful mission, was to be the guardian of the shadows, to be the watcher, to be the ghost who would always be there to fight for the truth, a truth that was more powerful than any lie, a truth that was more terrifying than any sword, a truth that was his new purpose, his new life, his new terrible destiny. He had lost everything, but he had found a purpose, a man who had become a legend, a ghost who had saved a republic that had no idea it had been in danger, and he knew that the war would continue, that the embrace would rise again, that the shadows would always need a guardian, and he would always be there to fight for the truth. He smiled, a thin, ancient, knowing smile, for she knew that the war was not over, that the embrace was a terrible, resilient thing, and that the shadows would always need a guardian, a ghost who would be there to fight for the truth. And Gaius, a man who had now become a legend, a living weapon, felt the truth of her words in the very marrow of his bones, a truth that was not a source of despair but a cold, quiet purpose that settled into the core of his being, a purpose that was as vast and as terrible as the city itself, a purpose that transcended the simple, foolish, idealistic notions of justice he had once held as a scribe. He had won a battle, a small, impossible victory that had saved Rome from within, but he knew, with a certainty that was more chilling than any cold wind, that he was now merely a sentry, a lonely, vigilant guardian on the front line of a war that would never truly end, a war against a hydra that would always grow new, more cunning, and more terrible heads. A war that he would have to fight not with grand speeches or acts of public defiance, but with patience, with silence, with a relentless, terrifying vigilance that would be his new and terrible way of life. His new world was a world of darkness and of echoes, a world where the stench of the sewers was as familiar as the air he breathed, a world where the scuttling of unseen creatures was the only music, a world where his only friends were the ghosts of the lost, the echoes of the men and women who had seen the truth and had been silenced, and he learned to live in that world not as a man, but as a creature of it, a silent, unseen predator who moved through the labyrinthine tunnels with the quiet, effortless grace of a master, a man who had not just learned to survive in the shadows, but had become them. He cultivated his network, a vast and intricate web of spies and informants that was a perfect mirror of the embrace, a network of the desperate, the disillusioned, the forgotten, a network of beggars and of thieves and of slaves and of prostitutes, the people who saw the lies and the corruption but who had no voice, no power, no way to fight back, and he spoke to them in whispers. He taught them the language of the shadows. He taught them to be ghosts, to be watchers, to be guardians of the truth, and his network grew, a silent, unseen rebellion that was the first, and only, line of defense against a new and more terrible kind of enemy. For the embrace, a wounded but not defeated beast, had learned from its defeat, it had learned from the public humiliation of Tiberius, it had learned that brute force and open corruption were a weakness, a flaw in the design of their beautiful, terrible machine, and a new leader had risen from its ashes, a man who was not a soldier or a politician, but a philosopher, a scholar. A man who was a master of whispers and a master of lies, a man named Cassius, whose face was not a mask of power and arrogance, but a mask of quiet, contemplative intelligence, a man who believed, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that Rome's greatness had always been a lie, a beautiful, fragile illusion that could only be maintained through the hidden, disciplined hand of a secret society, a man who saw Gaius not as a threat, but as a curiosity, a fascinating flaw in the fabric of their world that had to be corrected, not with violence, but with a terrible, patient, and psychological war. Cassius did not send his men into the sewers, for he knew that the ghost could not be found in the darkness, but instead, he began to use the very tools that Gaius had used, a quiet, methodical war of whispers and of secrets, a war of disinformation, a war that was designed to make Gaius's victory hollow, to make his truth meaningless, to make his network turn on itself. He began to plant lies, to spread rumors, to twist the truth until it was unrecognizable, a terrible, insidious poison that he began to inject into the city's heart, a new kind of corruption that was more subtle, more dangerous, and more resilient than the old, and he used his network of spies and informants, a new, more loyal network than the last, to feed his lies, to whisper them into the ears of the senators, the merchants, the beggars, and even into the ears of Gaius's own people, a terrible, psychological war that was designed to break the ghost from within. Gaius, the silent guardian of the shadows, felt a change in the air, a subtle shift in the silence of the city's underbelly, a new kind of cold, a new kind of fear that was not a fear of violence, but a fear of the unknown, a fear of the lie that was so perfect it felt like the truth, and he knew that the Hydra had a new head, a more cunning and more dangerous one, and he knew that this war would be fought not with iron, but with the fragile, beautiful, and terrible weapon of the truth. He began to see the signs, the small, almost imperceptible changes in the behavior of his own people, the quiet moments of doubt in the eyes of his spies, the subtle, almost inaudible whispers that told a new and terrible story, a story that was a lie, a story that was designed to make him a villain, a man who had not fought for justice, but for his own selfish reasons, a man who had betrayed his own people, and Gaius. The man who was a living testament to the truth, was now haunted by the lie. A lie that was a perfect, terrible weapon against a man who had nothing left to lose but his reputation. He knew that Cassius was trying to force him out of the shadows, to make him a man once more, a man who would be forced to fight a war in the light, a war that he could not win, and he felt a deep, profound weariness settle into his bones, a terrible knowledge that this war was not just about saving Rome, but about saving his own soul, about saving the truth he had risked everything to save. A truth that was now being twisted and contorted into a terrible, unrecognizable lie. And Antoninus, in the world of the light, in the halls of the Senate, felt the same poison, the same terrible, subtle change in the air, a quiet, insidious doubt that was spreading like a plague, a doubt that was being fed by the whispers, by the rumors, by the lies, and he knew that his alliance with the ghost was no longer a secret, that the whispers, the lies, were a new kind of weapon that was designed to bring him down, to expose him, to destroy his reputation and his life, and he felt a new, terrifying sense of isolation, for the men who had been his allies, the men who had seen the truth, were now looking at him with a strange, quiet suspicion, their eyes filled with a doubt that was a terrible, crushing weight, and he knew, with a certainty that was more terrifying than any sword, that his world, the world of the light, was no longer safe, that the shadows had reached into the highest offices, that the embrace, the Hydra, had learned to fight a new and more terrible kind of war, a war that he, a man of honor and of the law, was not equipped to fight. The hunt for the ghost had begun, again, but this time, the hunters were not just the embrace, but the very people he had tried to save, the people who had been convinced by a perfect, terrible lie that the ghost was a villain, a man who was a danger to the Republic, and Gaius, a man alone in the shadows, a man who had become a legend, a man who was now a villain, knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that the war was just beginning, and that his greatest enemy was no longer a man with a snake on his finger, but a man who was a master of the lie. The oracle, the woman who saw the truth, would not smile now, for she knew that a war of the light and a war of the dark had just begun, a terrible, quiet, and brutal war that would be fought for the very soul of Rome. A war that was no longer a simple contest of good versus evil but a terrifying, complex battle of perception against reality, a war that Gaius, a man who had become a legend, now found himself fighting not against swords or daggers but against a perfect, terrible lie that was eating away at his very soul, a lie that was being masterfully crafted and expertly disseminated by Cassius, the new leader of the Embrace, a man who understood that true power lay not in force, but in the control of the narrative, in the manipulation of truth itself. Cassius, a man whose face was a mask of quiet, contemplative intelligence, did not send his men into the sewers to hunt for the ghost, for he knew that the ghost could not be found in the darkness. Instead, he began to use the very tools that Gaius had used, a quiet, methodical war of whispers and of secrets, a war of disinformation, a war that was designed to make Gaius's victory hollow, to make his truth meaningless, to make his network turn on itself, a terrible, psychological war that was more insidious and more dangerous than any sword fight. He began to plant lies, to spread rumors, to twist the truth until it was unrecognizable, a terrible, insidious poison that he began to inject into the city's heart, a new kind of corruption that was more subtle, more dangerous, and more resilient than the old, and he used his network of spies and informants, a new, more loyal network than the last, to feed his lies, to whisper them into the ears of the senators, the merchants, the beggars, and even into the ears of Gaius's own people, a terrible, psychological war that was designed to break the ghost from within. Gaius, the silent guardian of the shadows, felt the change in the air, a subtle shift in the silence of the city's underbelly, a new kind of cold, a new kind of fear that was not a fear of violence, but a fear of the unknown, a fear of the lie that was so perfect it felt like the truth, and he knew that the Hydra had a new head, a more cunning and more dangerous one, and he knew that this war would be fought not with iron, but with the fragile, beautiful, and terrible weapon of the truth. He began to see the signs, the small, almost imperceptible changes in the behavior of his own people, the quiet moments of doubt in the eyes of his spies, the subtle, almost inaudible whispers that told a new and terrible story, a story that was a lie, a story that was designed to make him a villain, a man who had not fought for justice, but for his own selfish reasons, a man who had betrayed his own people, and Gaius. The man who was a living testament to the truth, was now haunted by the lie. A lie that was a perfect, terrible weapon against a man who had nothing left to lose but his reputation. He knew that Cassius was trying to force him out of the shadows, to make him a man once more, a man who would be forced to fight a war in the light, a war that he could not win, and he felt a deep, profound weariness settle into his bones, a terrible knowledge that this war was not just about saving Rome, but about saving his own soul, about saving the truth he had risked everything to save. A truth that was now being twisted and contorted into a terrible, unrecognizable lie. And Antoninus, in the world of the light, in the halls of the Senate, felt the same poison, the same terrible, subtle change in the air, a quiet, insidious doubt that was spreading like a plague, a doubt that was being fed by the whispers, by the rumors, by the lies, and he knew that his alliance with the ghost was no longer a secret, that the whispers, the lies, were a new kind of weapon that was designed to bring him down, to expose him, to destroy his reputation and his life, and he felt a new, terrifying sense of isolation, for the men who had been his allies, the men who had seen the truth, were now looking at him with a strange, quiet suspicion, their eyes filled with a doubt that was a terrible, crushing weight, and he knew, with a certainty that was more terrifying than any sword, that his world, the world of the light, was no longer safe, that the shadows had reached into the highest offices, that the embrace, the Hydra, had learned to fight a new and more terrible kind of war, a war that he, a man of honor and of the law, was not equipped to fight. The hunt for the ghost had begun, again, but this time, the hunters were not just the embrace, but the very people he had tried to save, the people who had been convinced by a perfect, terrible lie that the ghost was a villain, a man who was a danger to the Republic, and Gaius, a man alone in the shadows, a man who had become a legend, a man who was now a villain, knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that the war was just beginning, and that his greatest enemy was no longer a man with a snake on his finger, but a man who was a master of the lie. The oracle, the woman who saw the truth, would not smile now, for she knew that a war of the light and a war of the dark had just begun, a terrible, quiet, and brutal war that would be fought for the very soul of Rome. This war of whispers was far more chilling than any physical conflict Gaius had ever faced. The whispers were everywhere, a low, constant murmur that seeped into the very stones of the city, reaching even into the deep, echoing silence of the sewers that had once been his sanctuary. He heard it from his own network, from the beggars he had taught to be his eyes and ears, from the slaves who risked their lives to bring him snippets of conversation from the villas above, the insidious new narrative that painted him not as a hero but as a greedy, opportunistic criminal who had fabricated the entire story of the embrace to gain wealth and power for himself. The lie was simple, elegant, and brutally effective. Cassius had created a false narrative of a secret vault of gold and silver beneath the Senate, a vault that Gaius had supposedly discovered and was now hoarding, using his network to fund his own private army and to sow discord in the Republic for his own personal gain. The proof, Cassius's spies whispered, was in the fact that Gaius had disappeared, a man who had once been a poor scribe now vanished, his absence proof of his new, ill-gotten wealth. The whispers began to corrode Gaius's network from within. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the quiet, almost imperceptible betrayal in their gestures, the way they would hold back information, their fear not of the embrace, but of him, the ghost who was now a villain. He felt a deep, profound sadness, a crushing loneliness that was far worse than any physical pain, a terrible realization that he had not only lost his old life, but he was now losing his new one, his purpose, his allies, his last, best hope for redemption. He knew that Cassius was baiting him, that he wanted him to come out of the shadows, to be a man once more, a man who would be forced to defend himself against a lie that was a perfect, terrible weapon, for how does a ghost fight a rumor? How does a man who has no name and no reputation defend himself against a lie that has been designed to destroy him? The frustration and the desperation began to gnaw at him, a terrible, quiet rage that threatened to consume him, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had to do something, he had to act, he had to find a way to counter a lie with a physical truth, a tangible piece of evidence that could not be twisted, a truth that would be so powerful it would shatter the lie forever. He began to re-examine the oracle's map, his mind a new, dangerous engine of his will, searching for a solution, a path, a secret that Cassius did not know existed, a truth that was buried so deep, so completely, that it could not be corrupted by a whisper. He found a single, small, and almost completely indecipherable symbol on the edge of the map, a symbol that was a part of the city's oldest, most forgotten catacombs, a symbol that was not a secret door or a hidden passage, but a symbol of a deeper, older, and more terrifying truth, a truth that was a living, breathing testament to the Embrace's ancient history, to its terrible, unspoken beginning. A truth that was so old and so terrible that the oracle had not even spoken of it, a truth that was the very foundation of the Embrace's power. He knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that this was the answer, this was the way to fight a lie with a truth that was so powerful it would destroy the very foundation of Cassius's power, a truth that would be his final, desperate gambit. Meanwhile, in the world of the light, Antoninus felt the same poison, the same terrible, subtle change in the air, a quiet, insidious doubt that was spreading like a plague, a doubt that was being fed by the whispers, by the rumors, by the lies, and he knew that his alliance with the ghost was no longer a secret, that the whispers, the lies, were a new kind of weapon that was designed to bring him down, to expose him, to destroy his reputation and his life, and he felt a new, terrifying sense of isolation, for the men who had been his allies, the men who had seen the truth, were now looking at him with a strange, quiet suspicion, their eyes filled with a doubt that was a terrible, crushing weight, and he knew, with a certainty that was more terrifying than any sword, that his world, the world of the light, was no longer safe, that the shadows had reached into the highest offices, that the Embrace, the Hydra, had learned to fight a new and more terrible kind of war, a war that he, a man of honor and of the law, was not equipped to fight. The hunt for the ghost had begun, again, but this time, the hunters were not just the Embrace, but the very people he had tried to save, the people who had been convinced by a perfect, terrible lie that the ghost was a villain, a man who was a danger to the Republic, and Antoninus, a man of power and honor, a man who had lost his allies, his reputation, his very life, knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that he had been outmaneuvered, that he had been defeated by a master of the lie, and he felt a deep, profound sense of despair, a crushing loneliness that was a terrible, physical weight on his shoulders, a man who had tried to save Rome but had only succeeded in losing everything, a man who was now a ghost in his own world, a man who was no longer just a victim but a casualty of a war he did not even know he was fighting. The oracle, the woman who saw the truth, would not smile now, for she knew that a war of the light and a war of the dark had just begun, a terrible, quiet, and brutal war that would be fought for the very soul of Rome. The public, the people of Rome, were now turning on the ghost, the man they had once called a hero, a man who had brought a powerful senator to his knees, a man who had a terrible, chilling reputation, a man who was now, according to the whispers, a villain, a criminal, a man who had to be found and brought to justice, and a new reward, a terrible, magnificent reward, was placed on his head, a reward that was so large, so vast, that it would make a beggar a rich man, a man who would be willing to kill a legend for a lifetime of wealth. And Gaius, in the depths of the sewers, saw the new wanted posters that were being put up in the streets, posters that were not of a madman, but of a villain, a man who was a danger to the Republic, a man who had to be found, a man who had to be brought to justice, and he knew that Cassius, the master of the lie, had won the first battle. But Gaius, the man who had lost everything but had found a purpose, a man who was a living testament to the truth, a man who was a ghost, a man who was now a villain, smiled, a terrifying and liberating transformation that had taken hold of Gaius, the ghost, as he stood at the precipice of his final, desperate gambit, a single, all-or-nothing moment of truth that would either save Rome or bury him and the truth forever. The oracle's map, the ancient, scorched parchment that had been his holy text and his guide, was now a useless relic, for the knowledge he sought was not in the lines and the symbols of the surface world, but in the deeper, older, and more terrifying truths of the catacombs, a world that was as foreign to the map as the moon, a world that was the true, unspoken foundation of the Embrace's power. He knew that the War of Whispers had been lost, that Cassius, the master of the lie, had won the first battle, and that his only chance, his only way to counter a lie with a physical truth, a tangible piece of evidence that could not be twisted, was to go to the very heart of the Embrace's ancient and terrible secret, to the very place where the lie had begun, to the catacombs, the oldest, most forgotten part of the city. A place of death and of echoes, a place of terrible, unspoken truths. He had felt the signs, the subtle, almost imperceptible vibrations in the stones, the quiet, humming energy that had guided him to the small, almost completely indecipherable symbol on the edge of the map, a symbol that was not a secret door or a hidden passage, but a symbol of a deeper, older, and more terrifying truth, a truth that was a living, breathing testament to the Embrace's ancient history, to its terrible, unspoken beginning, a truth that was so old and so terrible that the Oracle had not even spoken of it, a truth that was the very foundation of the Embrace's power. He knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that this was the answer, this was the way to fight a lie with a truth that was so powerful it would shatter the lie forever, a truth that would be his final, desperate gambit. He would not be a hero of the light, but a god of the dark, a man who would bring a truth from the depths of the earth to save a republic that had no idea it was even in danger. He went to the Oracle, the woman who lived in the darkness, the woman who saw the truth, and he told her of his plan, of his final, desperate gambit, of his journey into the catacombs, and she did not try to stop him, she did not try to warn him, she simply looked at him, her ancient, knowing eyes filled with a new, quiet kind of reverence, for she saw not a man, but a legend. A god of the dark who was about to perform a terrible, beautiful act of salvation, and she gave him a single, small, an ancient oil lamp, a lamp that would not burn for long, but a lamp that would burn with the pure, unwavering light of a truth that was as old as the Republic itself, a lamp that would be his only guide in a world of absolute, terrifying darkness. He took the lamp, its small, flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the sewer, a single, perfect symbol of his terrible purpose, and he began his final journey, a journey that would take him from the relative safety of the sewers into the absolute, terrifying unknown of the catacombs, a place where the air was cold and still, a place where the echoes of the dead were the only sound, a place where the Embrace, the Hydra, had buried its deepest, darkest secrets. He followed the vibrations in the stones, the quiet, humming energy that was the only language he understood, and he descended, his body a wire of tense, coiled energy, his mind a sharp, focused instrument of his will, and he went deeper and deeper, into a world that was a beautiful, terrible, and terrifying contradiction, a world that was both a tomb of the dead and a cradle of a terrible, living power. He found the entrance, a small, unassuming hole in the wall, a place that was perfectly disguised, a place that was not on any map, a place that only a man who was a ghost, a man who could read the language of the stones, could ever find, and he slipped through, the old stone grinding in protest, and he was in the catacombs, a world of bones and of echoes, a world of death and of silence. He walked for what felt like an eternity, the small, flickering flame of his lamp casting a halo of light on the walls of bones, on the endless, silent rows of the dead, a terrible, beautiful testament to the fragility of life, and he felt a deep, profound sense of awe, a terrible reverence for the people who had built this place, for the people who had lived and had died and had been buried here, and he knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that this place was not just a tomb, but a library, a living history of the city, a place where the terrible, ancient truth was waiting to be found. He came to the heart of the catacombs, a vast, echoing chamber that was not filled with bones, but with a terrible, beautiful, and terrifying sight, a sight that was the very foundation of the Embrace's power, a sight that was the truth he had been searching for, a sight that was so powerful it would shatter the lie forever. In the center of the chamber, on a raised stone altar, was a single, small, an ancient iron chest, a chest that was not locked, a chest that was not guarded, a chest that was so unassuming that no one would ever know it was there, and in the chest, on a small, soft bed of old, rotten cloth, was a single, small, an ancient scroll, a scroll that was so old, and so brittle that it would turn to dust with a single touch. A scroll that was the first, the terrible, the beautiful and the chilling truth of the embrace. Gaius, his hands trembling, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, his mind a whirlwind of fear and a fragile, burning hope, reached out and gently, carefully, with a terrible reverence, touched the scroll, and it did not turn to dust, for the oracle's lamp, the small, flickering flame, had filled the room with a terrible, beautiful light, a light that had protected the truth from the ravages of time. A light that was a symbol of his terrible, quiet purpose, and he opened the scroll. His hands shaking, his mind reeling with the enormity of the discovery, and he saw it, a single, small, an ancient text, a text that was not a list of names or a list of secrets, but a text that was a list of all the terrible, unforgivable things the embrace had done, a list of all the lies they had told, a list of all the lives they had ruined, a list of all the people they had killed, a list that was a perfect, terrible, and chilling history of the embrace, a list that was the truth, and he knew, with a terrible, crushing certainty, that this was it, this was his final, desperate gambit, this was his way to fight a lie with the truth that was so powerful it would shatter the lie forever. He took the scroll, a heavy, cold weight in his hands, and he began to retrace his steps, to go back to the surface, to go back to the light, to go back to a world he no longer belonged to, a world where he was a villain, a world where he had to be a god, a man who was about to perform a single, terrible, and beautiful act of salvation. The hunt for the ghost had begun, again. But this time, the hunt was not a hunt to kill, but a hunt for the truth, a terrible, beautiful, and final hunt that would either save Rome, or bury him and the truth forever. A terrible, beautiful, and final knowledge that settled into the very core of Gaius's being as he clutched the ancient, fragile scroll, a scroll that was a perfect, terrible, and chilling history of the embrace. A heavy, cold weight in his hands, a weight that was not just paper and ink, but a living, breathing testament to a truth so old and so terrible it had been buried beneath the city for centuries. He began to retrace his steps, his feet moving with a new, quiet purpose through the labyrinthine tunnels of the catacombs, a world of bones and of echoes, a world of death and of silence that was now, for the first time, a world of terrible, quiet hope, for in his hands he held the key, the final, desperate gambit that would shatter the lie forever. He moved with a new kind of power, a power not of fear or of desperation, but a power of shared purpose, for he was no longer a man alone in the shadows, he was a living god of the dark who was about to bring a terrible, beautiful truth to the light, a truth that would either save a republic that had no idea it was even in danger, or bury him and the truth forever. As he ascended, the air growing warmer, the sounds of the city, the constant, low hum of a world of power and politics, of wealth and corruption, of law and lies, a low, distant murmur that grew louder with every step, he felt the terrible weight of his destiny, a weight that was a terrible, crushing burden, and a fragile, burning hope, for he knew that the war was not over, that the embrace was a terrible, resilient thing, and that the shadows would always need a guardian, a ghost who would be there to fight for the truth, and he knew that his final, terrible victory, a victory that would either save Rome or bury him and the truth forever, was the only thing that mattered. He emerged from the catacombs into the damp, familiar silence of the sewers, the small, flickering flame of the oracle's lamp casting a halo of light around him, and he was met by the oracle herself, the woman who lived in the darkness, the woman who saw the truth, her ancient, knowing eyes filled with a new, quiet kind of reverence, for she saw not a man, but a legend, a god of the dark who was about to perform a terrible, beautiful act of salvation, and she did not speak, for words were not needed in this world of shadows and secrets, but she simply nodded, a single, silent, powerful gesture that told him that she knew, that she understood, that she believed, and he knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that he was no longer a man alone in the shadows, he was a living god of the dark who was about to perform a terrible, beautiful act of salvation. He began to move, the oracle a silent shadow at his side, and they went to the surface, to a world he no longer belonged to, a world where he was a villain, a world where he had to be a god, and as they reached the surface, the bright, blinding light of the Roman sun was a terrible shock, a harsh, brutal contrast to the absolute, terrifying darkness of the catacombs, and he felt a wave of nausea, a terrible, physical reaction to a world he no longer belonged to, a world that had been corrupted. by a terrible, beautiful lie, a lie that was a perfect, terrible weapon against a man who had nothing left to lose but his reputation. He knew that the moment of truth was at hand, that Cassius, the master of the lie, was waiting, that the hunt for the ghost had begun, again. But this time, the hunt was not a hunt to kill, but a hunt for the truth, a terrible, beautiful, and final hunt that would either save Rome, or bury him and the truth forever. He went to the small, unassuming taberna in the Subura, the place of low talk and cheap wine, the place where he had met Servius for the first time, the place where the impossible, terrible alliance had been forged, and as he entered, the world of the light and the world of the dark collided, and he saw Antoninus, the senator, a man of power and honor, a man who had lost his allies, his reputation, his very life. A man who was a ghost in his own world, and he saw the look in his eyes, a look of despair and a terrible, quiet hope, a look that told Gaius that the old senator, a man of the light, was also a man who had been outmaneuvered, a man who had been defeated by a master of the lie, and a man who had a new and terrible purpose, a new and terrible mission to fight a war that he was not equipped to fight. Antoninus saw Gaius, not a villain, not a criminal, not a man who was a danger to the Republic, but a man who was a legend, a god of the dark who was about to perform a terrible, beautiful act of salvation, and he saw the look in his eyes, a look of quiet, terrifying purpose, a look that told him that the hunt for the truth was at hand, that the final, desperate gambit was about to begin, and he knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that the war was just beginning, and that his greatest enemy was no longer a man with a snake on his finger, but a man who was a master of the lie. Servius, the servant, the master of the city's whispers, saw them both, a man of the light and a man of the shadows, a man who was a legend and a man who was a ghost in his own world, and he knew that their alliance, a dangerous, impossible alliance, a partnership between a man of the surface and a creature of the shadows, was the last, best hope for the Republic, and he smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. A smile that told them that he was ready, that he was willing to fight for the truth, to fight for a war that he had not known existed just months before, a war that was now his terrible, beautiful destiny. They planned their final gambit, a terrible, beautiful act of defiance that would be a public, bombastic, and impossible act of rebellion, an act that would be so perfect, so complete, that it would shatter the lie forever. Gaius, the god of the dark, would emerge from the shadows, not as a man, but as a living testament to a truth so powerful it would shatter the lie forever, and he would present the scroll, the ancient, terrible, and beautiful history of the embrace, to the public, to the people of Rome, to the very people who had been convinced by a perfect, terrible lie that he was a villain, a criminal, a man who was a danger to the Republic. And Antoninus, a man of power and honor, a man who was a ghost in his own world, would use his influence, his remaining allies, his knowledge of the law, to ensure that the truth was heard, to ensure that the public, the people of Rome, would see the lie for what it was, a terrible, beautiful, and terrifying weapon against the truth. They would stage their final act of rebellion in the Forum, the heart of the Republic, a place of power and of politics, a place of law and of lies, a place where the truth would be a terrible, powerful, and liberating weapon, and they knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that this was their only chance, their only way to save Rome, their only way to find a peace that they had both lost, a peace that was the terrible, beautiful, and fragile truth. The night before, Gaius stood in the sewers, the ancient scroll in his hands, his mind a whirlwind of fear and a fragile, burning hope, and he felt a new, quiet sense of purpose, a purpose that was not of a man, but of a god, a purpose that was his terrible, beautiful destiny, a purpose that was to be the guardian of the shadows, to be the watcher, to be the ghost who would always be there to fight for the truth, and he smiled, a cold, hard, and terrifying smile, for he knew that the war was not over, that the embrace was a terrible, resilient thing, and that the shadows would always need a guardian, a ghost who would be there to fight for the truth. He was a man with nothing left to lose, a man who was a legend in a world he had once feared, a man who was a villain, but a man who was about to become a god. The day of the final gambit dawned, a brilliant, beautiful Roman sun rising over the city, its golden light a harsh, brutal contrast to the absolute, terrifying darkness of the catacombs, and Gaius, a man who was a living god of the dark, felt a new, quiet sense of power, a power that was not of fear or of desperation, but a power of shared purpose, a power that came from the knowledge that he was no longer alone. That his war was not a lonely battle but a terrible, desperate alliance against an enemy that was everywhere. He emerged from the shadows, not as a man, but as a legend, a man who was a living testament to a truth so powerful it would shatter the lie forever. And he walked through the streets of Rome, the people, the very people who had been convinced by a perfect, terrible lie that he was a villain, a criminal, a man who was a danger to the Republic, staring at him, their faces a mask of shock and a terrible, cold fury. Their eyes filled with a doubt that was a terrible, crushing weight. But Gaius, the god of the dark, did not flinch, he did not hesitate, he simply walked, his feet moving with a quiet, terrifying purpose, the ancient scroll, the terrible, beautiful, and chilling history of the embrace, a heavy, cold weight in his hands, a weight that was not just paper and ink, but a living, breathing testament to a truth so old and so terrible it had been buried beneath the city for centuries. He walked to the Forum, the heart of the Republic, a place of power and of politics, a place of law and of lies, a place where the truth would be a terrible, powerful, and liberating weapon, and he saw Antoninus, the senator, a man of power and honor, a man who was a ghost in his own world, a man who was waiting for him, his face a mask of worry and a terrible, quiet hope, and he saw the people. The thousands of people who had gathered to see the villain, the criminal, the man who was a danger to the Republic, a man who was a legend, and a man who was now a god. And in the heart of the Forum, surrounded by the power and the politics, the law and the lies, Gaius, the god of the dark, raised the scroll, the ancient, terrible, and beautiful history of the embrace, and he began to speak, his voice not a whisper, but a roar, a terrible, beautiful, and terrifying roar that was a living, breathing testament to a truth so old and so terrible it had been buried beneath the city for centuries. A truth that would either save Rome, or bury him and the truth forever.